Hey guys, this is Heri from Týr. One thing a lot of people ask me about is the language of the Faroe Islands. Do we speak Danish or a dialect of Icelandic or Norwegian? Here I will give you an overview of how the independent language Faroese came to be. The Faroese language is spoken in the Faroe Islands by over 50,000 inhabitants. There are also more than 20,000 native speakers of Faroese living in Denmark, and a few thousand in Iceland and Norway. The language is closely related to Icelandic and Norwegian, and a bit more distantly related to Danish and Swedish. It all started with Old Norse, which I'm sure most of you language nerds are more familiar with. The language spoken by the inhabitants of Scandinavia in the early Middle Ages, colloquially known as the Vikings. Old Norse is classified as the language these people spoke from the 8th century to the mid-14th century. At that point, we classify it as having begun the split into two distinct dialects, East Norse and West Norse. Very soon after, these dialects diversified further and eventually became the modern Norse languages as we know them today. The East Norse languages are Danish and Swedish. In mainland Scandinavia, this was probably, as it is today, a dialect continuum, but in the Faroes and Iceland you get more isolated languages. West Norse developed into 5 languages. Going from east to west, they are Norwegian, Norn, Faroese, Icelandic and Greenlandic Norse. Norn and Greenlandic Norse are extinct. Norn, spoken in Shetland, Orkney and on Caithness, was completely taken over by Scots, starting in the 1400s in Caithness and finally in Shetland by 1850. And the Norse settlers in Greenland didn't last. Norse settlers first reached Greenland in 986 AD. Around 1300, they either abandoned the settlement and traveled back east, or their supply lines were cut off by the onset of the Small Ice Age and the settlers died out. There is some debate among scholars about this. In any case, when a route from Norway to Greenland was re-established in 1721 by the Norwegian Hans Egede, there were no Norse settlers to be found. Greenland Norse did leave some loanwords in the local Kalalit language, which is the main Greenlandic Inuit language. So how did Faroese come to be? From the 9th to the 15th century, Old Norse slowly developed in a particular direction in the Faroe Islands. By the 15th century, we call the language Old Faroese. There is simply not enough written material from this period to say which development happened when or where precisely, only that it happened between 1380 and 1700. After the union of Norway and Denmark in 1380, when Olaf Håkonsson inherited the thrones of both countries, Faroese and Norwegian ceased to be written languages, and they were replaced by Danish in matters of administration and education. This was during the very last stages of what we classify as Old Norse, so the development into the different modern Norse languages had begun. Faroese was preserved in folk ballads, folk tales, and everyday life. For about 300 years, there are hardly any written records of Faroese. This only changed when the Faroese Wenceslaus Ulricus Hammershaimb, commonly named Wenzel, established the modern Faroese orthography in 1854. Since then, we've developed a relatively rich modern literature. Hammershaimb's orthography is in use to this day. He applied a very archaic set of rules, which makes written Faroese and written Icelandic mutually intelligible. In other words, in the Faroes, we don't write as we speak. Very far from it. We write as we would have written if Faroese were an uninterrupted written language. I can mention as an anecdote that when I lived in Iceland for a year in 1999, for my first interaction with spoken Icelandic, it might as well have been Chinese. I couldn't understand a word they were saying. But since the vocabulary and grammar are very similar, it took me only about 3 months to get the hang of it. I just had to attune my ear to the dialect, which is radically different from Faroese. Needless to say, Icelandic has retained a more archaic grammar than Faroese, because they had a very rich written tradition throughout their entire history. Faroese has retained a bit less Old Norse grammar than Icelandic, but a bit more than Norwegian, so our geographical situation nicely reflects our linguistic relations. Here's a random sentence in Faroese. Góðan bygg fyri Føroyum. Her regnar ofta. Written like this in the International Phonetic Alphabet. In English translation, good day, I live in the Faroes. Here it rains often. Notice the GV in bygve. It's a very common thing in Faroese that sets it apart from the other Nordic languages. Also notice that the dative ending M in Føroyun is pronounced N. In Old Norse that might have been Góðan dag, ek by I Færøyum, her rigner oft. In modern Icelandic it is Góðan daginn, jeg by I Færøyum, her rigner oft. And in Danish that is Goddag, jeg bor på Færøerne, her regner det ofte. In Norwegian bokmål that is God dag, jeg bor på Færøyene, her regner det ofte. And in modern Swedish that would be God dag, jeg bor på Færøerne, her regner det ofte. I hope that gives you a basic understanding of where the language Faroese fits in. Anyways, I hope you liked this video. If you did, give it a thumbs up and share it with all your language nerd friends. And subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Heartfelt thanks to my patrons on Patreon. They are, among others, Benny Olsen, Greg Stuck, Tuesday Publishing, Erica Wareski, Tiffany Lee, Graham Peebles, Joy Costello, Devin Bergman, Juan Gonzalez, Michael Lewandowski, Mike Heinz and Scott. If you'd like to support my video production here on YouTube, please go to patreon.com/Heri Joensen and have a look. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next time. Cheers.